I am going to call a public hearing to order by the Planning and Economic Development Committee on Tuesday, May 16th at 7:06 p.m. and in the Aldermanic Chamber. And I will call the roll. Alderwoman Melizzi Golia present. Alderman Moriarty is not here. He contacted me and he had a work commitment that prevented him from being here. Alderman McCarthy.
Present.
Alderman Lopez.
I'm here.
And Alderman Clemens.
Here.
And also in attendance is Attorney Leonard. So our public hearing tonight is regarding ordinance 17036, amending the accessory dwelling ordinance. And I will ask Attorney Leonard to just give us a brief explanation of the ordinance, please.
Sure. It actually starts at the state level. In March of last year, the New Hampshire legislature enacted a new statute that put in place requirements for accessory dwelling units. And they needed to be put in place in the state by June 1st, 2017. So the city of Nashua has been working to amend the current ordinance to both fulfill Nashua's goals and meet the state statute. So ordinance 01736 has those amendments to meet the state requirements in it.
Okay, thank you. So I will now call for testimony in favor. And seeing no one, testimony in opposition. There's none. Testimony in favor. None. And testimony in opposition. None. And so we will declare the hearing closed at 7:08. Thank you. And I will now call to order a meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee at 7:09 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. Alderman Melizzi Golia, I am here. Alderman Moriarty is absent due to a work commitment. Alderman McCarthy.
Present.
Alderman Lopez. And Alderman Clemens.
Here.
And also in attendance, we have Attorney Leonard. Director Marchant was unable to join us this evening due to a conflict, and so Attorney Leonard is joining us to represent her. Public comment. There's no one here. And communication. I have a communication from Roger Houston, Planning Director, regarding the Planning Board recommendation on Ordinance 17036. Do I have a motion to accept and place on file?
So moved.
Alderman McCarthy. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
And opposed?
Nay.
Okay. Okay. Motion carries. Unfinished business, we have none. New business, we have none. And new business ordinances, 017-036, amending the accessory dwelling ordinance, and as indicated, it received a favorable recommendation from the planning board with the suggestion that there be an amendment to include one additional off-street parking space to accommodate the additional accessory dwelling. Do I have a motion to amend paragraph 7 to read one additional off-street parking space required above the minimum standard for a single-family house?
So moved.
Alderman McCarthy?
So
Discussion? I'm sorry.
moved. Just so moved.
Oh, yes. And do I have discussion?
On this motion?
Yeah. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and that motion carries. And so Is there, Alderman Clemmons?
Uh, I have a couple questions if I could.
Could we just, if
Oh,
we could
sure,
have a
sure.
motion?
Yep.
Alderman Lopez?
I'd like to make a motion to recommend final passage
Okay. As amended,
as amended.
yes. Alderman Clemmons, please.
My question is in regards to, it looks like paragraph 4, which was requiring that the person living there have to be a blood relative, is taken out.
Correct.
My question is that for previous units that fell under this, would that now would that make that an exemption?
Alderman,
I would assume that restriction is now lifted from all existing units because of the way the state law is written.
yeah. And
Okay.
that was my understanding when we discussed this at a prior
Yeah.
meeting.
And then my second question is my second question is really about the covenant. What happens when a house that has put an accessory dwelling unit in it and has this covenant is sold?
Wait, say that again?
So the covenant's filed with, I assume, the
Registry.
Registry of Deeds, right? So what happens when after the secondary unit is built and then the current owner decides that they're going to sell their house? What happens? Do they have to make that back into a single family home?
No. The deed covenant simply says they'll obey all of the laws that apply to the property as long as they have the dwelling unit, but that goes from owner to owner.
So does that restrict the new buyer from buying it as a rental property?
What do you mean?
Because the ordinance states that, where is it?
I think I understand your question.
Yeah, it says that it has to be owner occupied, basically. So my question is that if after the first person who owns it sells it, does it still have to be an owner occupied house under the covenant?
Yes. Or the principal residence, one of the units has to be the principal residence of the owner of the property.
So it cannot become a two-family rental property.
Correct.
With the owner off-site.
Right.
And see, I fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think that's, to me, I think that's too restrictive to a person who wants to sell their property, and I think it devalues the home because you can only go after one segment of the population who wants to live in an owner-occupied house, with a rental unit. I mean, it would be my preference to strike the covenant and just or make it so that the covenant only covers when it's initially built. Because I think I agree sort of with the idea that, we want these to be owner occupied to begin with. But, when it comes to 10, 15 years down the road and somebody wants to retire and move to Florida and things like that, I think, I think we're putting too much restriction on that, and any value that was in the house might be taken away.
Alderman Lopez?
I actually appreciate the covenant, just because it would avoid having developers using the accessory dwelling as a way to buy houses that have eligible units, develop them, and then move out, which is not necessarily the intent. So with that regard, I actually think it's a good thing to keep us from having more absentee landlords, basically two at a time. I also think that if a person's buying a house and it currently has the house and then the attached dwelling, they are entering into that situation knowing what's right in front of them. If they have to make the decision to evict the tenant in order to get the house, then that's a process that they should have to go through, knowing what they're getting into. But it doesn't change the fact that it's still a house. I mean, a house is a house. So I think if a person enters into the situation and can see what they're getting, then there isn't any necessary overly restrictive practice going on here. I think the fundamental nature of the house has changed a little bit by adding on an extra room, but if a person doesn't, if a person wants that extra tenant, then they know that going into it, that that's what they're entering into. And if they don't, then they can go through that process and then turn it back into a house.
Alderman Clemmons?
My issue also with this is that it restricts an investor from buying the property. So if I'm somebody that wants to buy a property that has 2 units for the purposes of renting it out, I can't do that with these. It also prevents a house that's been owned for a very long time in one family. It also prevents that person from keeping their property unless they live there. Um, and then they would have to sell it, I guess, under this proposal. So there's just some inherent problems that I think get really messy down the line with the covenant. And while I think that it's good intentioned, I think that it's not a. I just don't agree with it.
It's not the covenant that's the issue, actually. It's paragraph 5.
Well, if I could.
Oh, I'm sorry, Alderman Clemmons, yeah.
Yeah, it's paragraph 5, and I think maybe we could tweak that, to say the owner at the time of construction of the secondary unit or something like that. But, I would support something like that. But I think about places like, I think about my parents' house that has an accessory dwelling unit. If they were to, right now it's their primary residence, they're snowbirds. So I think about that unit, and I think about the fact that, once they pass on, I'm going to have to sell that house. That doesn't sit right with me. The house has been the house that I grew up in. I don't necessarily want to live there, but I do, probably want to keep the property in the family. And so it's situations like that. I can think of a couple other examples too, of folks that I know that built in-law apartments, and those people have passed on now. And what do you do when the principal owner decides that, they want to keep their house, but they want to move? I just don't. I think it's an unfair situation, especially when you're building something like that because you're helping out an elderly individual, such as my grandmother, who moved in there, lived there for 20 years, and then she passed away. And now, because you're doing something benevolent, you're getting punished for it. I don't think that was the intent of the law. I also see Alderman Lopez's point in that the intent of the law wasn't so that people could come in and make a bunch of duplexes in the city out of single-family homes. So I think we need to find some kind of common ground, um, you know, so that we can work with the people that own properties like this.
Alderman McCarthy.
Oh, I don't know, I think, you create that issue when you put the accessory dwelling unit in, because frankly, if I'm searching for another house and I look at one that has an accessory dwelling unit, my reaction to that's gonna be, that's 800 feet of space I don't need to pay for and don't need to pay taxes on. Let's move on to the next property. So it's not, it is something that is restrictive to begin with. I don't know how much success we'd have with saying the first owner, because now we're creating a protection that doesn't follow the property and simply, in effect, punishes one owner. You might be able to say for a period of 10 years after the exception is granted or something like that. But I don't, I'm not, and I'm sensitive to the fact that it allows a production of more absentee landlord properties if we don't have some covenant in there of that type. Bear in mind, this is not in, the rental heavy sections of the zones. This is in
Mhm.
basically the R9 through R40 zones that this is gonna have an effect.
Mhm.
Alderman Lopez.
I guess I'm confused. Is the category of accessory dwelling unit an irreversible one where if it becomes an accessory dwelling unit and somebody's living in it, then now it can't be anything else? It can't revert? I would have thought that if no one was living in it, then it's just a house.
I mean, I believe that's what typically happens now, under the current law. If you move out and someone buys your house, it just reverts back to a single-family home, and you have that extra space that you
Yes,
could allow right now, a blood relative to move into, but otherwise, you're just buying a house that has that extra space.
that is true. That is true, but I've never been a fan of that and to begin with, for the reasons that I stated. And I think that, you know, we have an opportunity to try to come up with something that allows a family to to keep their property without having to live there.
Alderman Lopez.
Can I ask if a family, if say you have a owner occupied dwelling and there's one family in the main house and then there's a relative in the secondary house, and the secondary, accessory dwelling unit is no longer occupied, so there's only just the one family, and that family passes on or moves away or whatever, couldn't they just give that whole unit to another family member and it can stay in the family because now you don't have a tenant in the accessory dwelling unit? Is that a question maybe I should direct at Attorney Leonard?
Yeah, I'm just, Attorney Leonard, your thoughts?
If I think I understand what you're saying is that if the accessory dwelling unit is empty,
Yeah.
can it just be treated as a single family? And I would say yes, because it's the use of the accessory dwelling unit that actually creates it. Because here it says the continued use of the accessory dwelling unit is conditioned upon compliance with the law. So if you're not using it for a second family, if you're just renting, for example, perhaps an hypothesis, the whole property to somebody, you're not necessarily using the ADU as an ADU, it's just additional space. I think there's an argument there, yes. There's going to be fact specific though, so I always hesitate a little going down the hypothetical, but yeah.
Never
it's-
sure.
Alderman McCarthy.
That actually brings up an interesting question, which is, if I build one of these and I sell it to someone whose intent is to rent it, how do we know if the dwelling unit, the accessory dwelling unit, is actually being used as an accessory dwelling unit? I mean, if I go back and look at the fact that we can't actually legislate what a family is.
Right.
So if the collective set of tenants say, oh, we're just one big happy family, how do we have any way to enforce the owner occupancy against the owner of the property at that point?
All right, well, well, the owner part, I think, is sort of easy. I mean, that's going to be the deed. It's going to have to, the owner part, I think, is easier, I think, if I'm understanding, because that's going to be whoever's named on the deed.
I'm
Although if
just,
it's a
I'm just
trust, that's
saying,
an issue.
other than the fact that there are two checks going to the owner, one to pay for the accessory dwelling unit and one to
Oh, I
pay
see.
for the main house, how would we ever know that the accessory dwelling unit was still in use as an accessory dwelling unit?
Yeah. I think you could, if there was as an enforcement issue, I think that you might be able to look at the other circumstances that surround the relationship. I just sort of guessing. I mean, what would you look at? How do they pay for groceries? I mean, it's just a thought.
I mean, how is that different from two people rent a house from a landlord and each of them sends the landlord a check for half of the rent for the month?
Right, and they each have their own
It
kitchen.
really comes down to determining what a family is, which we can't do.
Alderman Clements?
Well, I guess I'm not following because I think we took out the blood relative part, correct? Or that's
Yes.
the intent? So the real question, I guess, is the owner occupancy. Because if you take out the blood relative part, then it doesn't matter who's in the second unit.
But here's the problem. If there's a second unit, then the owner has to live in one of them.
Yes.
If it's simply a rental property, the owner does not have to live there.
Correct.
So there's actually no way for us to tell, other than very close inspection, whether the accessory dwelling unit is in use as an accessory dwelling unit or has three more rooms that are connected to the house.
If I,
Alderman Clements?
yeah, except that you can do a tax search and see that if that person lives somewhere else and has two properties in the city of Nashua, I'm pretty sure that the code enforcement could figure it out very easily.
That's not my point.
Well, I
It'd be
don't get
very
what-
easy for a landlord to simply cover up the fact that the accessory dwelling unit was being rented as a separate rental.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
If two people just share the rent on a house they rent together and send two checks to the landlord, how do we tell if they're living on opposite sides of a locked door or not?
Alderman Lopez?
I don't know that we can do that in a lot of cases now. I know that if somebody says that this person's living with me, then they're more or less able to, unless they go beyond things like the fire code. I mean, you can do things like counting how many beds are there, or if they try to use a separate address, you could use that. But this isn't a new problem being created by the legislation. It's just adding it to the pot of people who say, okay, everybody who lives here, pay me cash, and I'm the one who's on the lease.
Alderman Clements?
No,
Alderman
It is new for the legislation because this is the only place where we're requiring owner occupancy of a property essentially. So I'm rapidly coming to the conclusion that paragraph 5 doesn't do us a lot of good anyway, and probably it may make sense to strike it.
Alderman Clements?
I guess, there has to be some kind of middle ground on this, because I completely understand what Alderman Lopez was saying. And I'm very sensitive to that. And, on the other hand, though, there has to be a way to, yeah, I mean, I guess this is what it comes down to, is really comes down to the city's will and what we, and the amount of money and resources that we put into code enforcement is really what it comes down to. Because if we should, so in other words, so somebody's gonna have to go out and get a building permit for these. And that, if they get approved, if everything goes through the planning process and gets approved and everything, the code enforcement should know. Because now you are creating a rental unit, essentially. Whether it's, somebody whose family there, it's now a rental unit, one unit or the other, and it comes under the city's code enforcement, more so than just a general property, because there's things that, tenants have rights and things like that. So, it would seem to me that these particular properties, maybe what should be done is have, maybe we can put this in the ordinance, is that whenever the property is sold, or whenever one of these is applied for, that code enforcement is notified. And that way, they have a record of what's going on, because they're very busy, that department's very busy. But if they get notified that, okay, this address now is going to have an accessory dwelling unit, and then 10 years later, this address with the accessory dwelling unit sold to a new person, code enforcement can then reach out to them and say, hey, I noticed that you're the new owner of this house. What's your intentions? Blah, 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 blah. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so if that's truly a concern of ours, perhaps something like, perhaps eliminating number 5 and adding something that code enforcement is notified when these are built and sold, might help the situation, because we have absentee landlords in the city, and that is a problem. But a lot of times it's because people, either code doesn't know, or the people that live there are intimidated to call or don't know to call. And that was an issue that we dealt with 10 years ago, a big issue in this city, and it's gotten better. But there are still things that we need to do. So I think maybe that might be a middle ground. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels.
Alderman Lopez?
Still having difficulty with the problem here. If you have a house and it was rented and it has an owner-occupied accessory dwelling unit, when it's created, one side, either the house or the accessory dwelling unit, and the owner decides to leave, either he sells the entire unit as a rental property, in which nobody can live in the accessory dwelling unit because they're all renters. There's no owner living on the property. That owner would take responsibility for making sure that they know who's living in the property that they're renting out. If it is going to another owner and the owner lives in the little part or the big part, it's still an owner-occupied accessory dwelling unit.
Alderman Clemmons.
What is the motion on the floor right now?
It's for final passage as amended. I guess my concern is that we don't end up with properties in neighborhoods that, again, become simply rental properties. And I certainly understand someone can buy a house and move away, or not even ever move in and rent it, and you rent it to two people and one of them lives in one part and one lives in the other. So you really don't have any idea how they're using that space. But my concern is that being able to do that just makes those homes that have accessory dwellings more attractive to that option. And, and having rental properties in primarily single-family owner-occupied homes, and what that does to neighborhoods if we start seeing a lot of those. To your point, I totally understand if I'm buying this house and it's got 2 units in it, could I not rent them out as 2 units? Alderman McCarthy.
Yeah, a couple of questions. When does the state law take effect? Is it
I think it's
June?
June 1st.
First.
Yep.
Since this has had its first reading, this is actually in effect at the moment for the next 120 days. So if we don't pass something else by June 1st, what's on the table will be in effect when the law goes into effect.
Correct.
Okay. A question in paragraph 1, we deleted the section that limited the accessory dwelling unit to 30% of the gross floor area. Are we not allowed to regulate that under the new state law, or?
No, we can establish a minimum and a maximum size for the accessory dwelling unit, provided that that cannot be restricted to anything less than 750 square feet. So the minimum in this case was used as the maximum.
But can we have the limitation on what portion of the floor area that can be?
Yes, as long as there's provision that then doesn't say it has to be smaller than 750 square feet. So it could be something like, 30%, right, 30% of the principal resident, but in no event less than 750 square feet. It would allow for larger units is what it would do.
Here's my issue was, basically, I think the situation that we're concerned with, if you take a 2,000 square foot house in the R30 district, and put a 750 square foot ADU on it, yeah, it looks like an in-law apartment. Somebody's gonna occupy the house that takes care of the place. If you pick up a 1,500 square foot house in the R9 zone, divide it in half, you now have two 750 square foot rental units, which I think is the scenario we're concerned with. But we can't, but if we were to say it has to be 750 square feet and the rest of the house has to be 1,500 square feet above that, it sounds like we can't do that under the new state law.
I'm reading. So you want to, okay. So the 750 square feet minimum / maximum here is in place, that's state law. But then can we then say that that has to be a certain percentage of the larger principal dwelling? So you don't have your ADU the
Yeah.
same size or dwarfing.
I mean, it
Right,
seems to
you're-
me in a building envelope where you can only fit 1,500 square feet, it's probably inappropriate to have the accessory dwelling unit in the first place. And
Well, I think though that's assuming that you're going to be building it. I mean, one of the things we talked about the last time we discussed this was, do people make modifications to the interior of their house?
yeah, but I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about having
The addition.
Oh,
a property that is only two 750 square foot dwelling units.
I think, do we? I think you then look at B1. The accessory dwelling unit shall be clearly incidental and subordinate in extent, use, and purpose to the primary structure. Oh, that's the one we're looking at. But I think you can look to that first, you can look to the first section there. And if it's the same size and has the exact same use, it's fact specific. But I don't think, to your question, I mean, does the state law say that we can't have it, mandate some proportionality? I think that the state law would allow that. I do. Because they speak to, that may go to things like aesthetic. It might, depending on how it's designed. So I think that that's allowed. We can't say that the unit can be smaller than 750 square feet, but I think that clearly where we're saying that it has to be incidental, we can put some parameters around what that might mean. And, for example, if it's as big or almost as big as the primary unit, maybe we're not getting into incidental anymore. I also I was re-looking, if I may, at my answer for what happens if you you're not using your ADU, and one family's just living there, or quote, one family, and Alderman McCarthy's correct, we can't define family. I think that going to code enforcement, I know that from what I understand, if they go into a structure and there's 2 living units, and that's defined in the code, the unit's got a kitchen, whatever, they're gonna look to either that it's lawful under either it's a lawful 2-family or a lawful ADU. And so if people are actually occupying that space. So if it's totally unoccupied, okay, but if people are actually occupying it, I think they'll definitely look that there's gonna be an owner occupying. So I actually think that maybe my previous answer wasn't as concise as it could have been. I think that that's really what's gonna be. If, for example, you buy the house and you're like, we don't need that second kitchen, and we wanna use the space, do something so that so that it wouldn't be defined as a dwelling unit, then I think it can be you still have that one family thing, right? But as long as it can be defined as a dwelling unit, it's gonna have to meet either the ADU law or duplex or something. So that's in looking at a little further. Because
Oh,
code,
okay, so it doesn't matter how it's being used, the fact that it has 2 separable living spaces with kitchens
yeah,
makes it an ADU, whether you're using it as that or not.
I would say so, yeah, because that's what they're gonna look at, because, and to sort of the conversation earlier, that's the facts on the ground, right? I mean, if you've got
Yeah,
2
I like-
dwelling units, right, that could be, if it walks like a duck,
I
it
like
could
that
be
a lot
used.
better, 'cause
And I think that's how it would be looked at, so.
So I guess I would like to understand whether we can leave I think 30% is probably a small number, because that requires the rest of the house then to be 1,750 square feet. But if we made that, say, 35, so that you can have 2,250 square foot house, 750 of which is the ADU, I think that would address some of the concerns.
I need to do some quick math on that.
Hmm?
So that would, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Alderman Clements.
So it'd have to
please.
be like a 2,500 square foot house, right?
Depending on what number you put in, I mean, right now, if you left it at 30%,
It'd be 2,500.
then you need 7 times 250 or 1,750 square feet of other space to have a 750 square foot dwelling unit.
So
So
that,
it would be 2,250 as the minimum under the 30% number.
yeah, so 30%, does not exceed 30% of the
Right.
gross.
Right.
Oh, not a minimum, does not exceed. Okay.
Alderman Lopez.
If we make significant changes to how this is calculated, shouldn't we send it back to the city planning board too to review it?
We probably should.
My opinion is they've looked at it and made their recommendation, and we're probably just treading over ground that they've already walked over.
Alderman McCarthy.
My experience with the planning board over 2 decades is vastly different.
Alderman Clemmons.
Yeah, I guess, I guess I would just like to see paragraph 5 taken out, altogether, is my main concern with this. I just find it to be overly restrictive, regardless of everything else.
Alderman McCarthy.
One thing we could do there is to simply require that for a period of time. I think we could say for a period of not less than 5 years after the granting of the special exception.
Alderman Clemmons, please.
I would support that. Because that at least prevents, people from coming in and buying homes that would fit the criteria to do that and then flip it. In other words, you would have to be committed to that property. So, and that I think is the spirit of the intent, because after the fact, I mean, a million things could happen, and I think once a property is what it is, I am of the opinion that if it's been a 2-unit house for 5, 10 years, whatever it is, I just think that I guess I don't have the concern. I don't have an overwhelming concern that nefarious things are going to happen just because there's duplexes across the city. I just, I work in Cambridge. It's a city that, is very densely populated, and it's probably the most expensive place to live, in New England, if not the United States. So is San Francisco. So is New York City. And I'm not saying that I want to turn Nashua into any of those places, but what I am saying is that it's possible to have nice neighborhoods with properties that have more than one unit. And I think, if we keep on top of it, and we invest in our code enforcement department, that we'll be in fine shape.
Alderman Lopez.
So if we amend it to say, the owner of the property must occupy either the primary or accessory dwelling unit as the owner's principal place of residence for a minimum of 5 years, I think was suggested. How does that add any protection other than a criteria which could blow up in somebody's face? When I see little requirements like that after 5 years you can do that, usually the person who suffers from that is the person who has the least flexibility, which is the person we actually most want to protect in this situation.
I don't follow.
McCarthy.
I don't see it that way. What it does is it says, as Alderman Clemens says, you can't buy the property, put an ADU on it, and flip it to somebody who's just gonna do rentals. It basically says, if you're gonna do this, you need to do it for a situation that you're going to use for some period of time as the owner of the property and resident of the property.
Alderman Lopez.
So we'd be creating a scenario where somebody who's living there for 4 years and 9 months now has to stay there for another 3 months if they want to conclude this accessory dwelling unit need. Whereas otherwise, it would just be, no, it just reverts back to a house. If the next person's not going to live there, they're just not going to live there.
Alderman McCarthy.
They can always appeal that to the zoning board of adjustment. If you, anything that's in zoning laws, you can ask for relief from if it becomes burdensome.
Alderman Lopez.
Could they ask to appeal the requirement that they live in the accessory dwelling unit?
Probably.
I mean, it doesn't matter what we do then.
It's a, I mean, that's a, oh. It's a tough sell on hardship, but that doesn't mean you can't sell it.
Right.
Oh, Alderman Clemmons, I'm sorry.
Well, I would move to further amend paragraph 5 with the following.
I have an amendment
Oh,
written. If you want.
I will defer to Alderman McCarthy.
I would move to amend paragraph 5 by adding at the end, for a period of at least 5 years following the granting of the special exception.
Okay, so at the end of paragraph 5, adding for a period of at least 5 years after
The granting
the
of the
granting of the special
exception.
exception for the
Yeah.
dwelling unit. Any further discussion on the Alderman Lopez?
So, I mean, if they can appeal it, then I guess I'm not going to split hairs over this last point. But I guess my last question is this a significant enough change that we have to send it back to the planning board?
Alderman McCarthy.
I think we can if we want to. I don't think we need to schedule another public hearing, because, I mean, we're basically making it less restrictive than it was by doing that, so I don't think anyone will challenge that, but we could ask the planning board to take another look at it after the amendment.
Alderman Clemmons.
Here, just a little question on the wording. How long does the special exception? So the way that you read it was after 5 years after the granting of the special exception. How long do those grants last for? So in other words, could I buy this house, rent it out for 5 years as a single family, and then?
Well, that's actually a really difficult question, I think, in this particular case. When you get a grant from us on land use, they're typically good for a year for you to start construction. So basically, if you go in and get a site plan approved, for example, you have a year to get a building permit, and you have either a year or 2 years after that to complete it and get the certificate of occupancy.
So,
But in this particular case, there may not be anything other than the special exception that we ever see.
that
Alderman Clemmons.
I would like to change that to can you read the wording again?
Yes, we're amending it, so it says for a period, it must live there for a period of at least 5 years after the granting of the special exception for the accessory dwelling.
Could we change that to say after the construction of the accessory dwelling unit is complete?
That's the point. I don't know that there necessarily is construction that we get to inspect. If all I'm doing is putting in a door between one set of rooms and another, we may never see that. We may never issue, there may be a single certificate of occupancy that is valid through that entire process, and we may never actually approve anything else. We could make it after the granting of a certificate of occupancy, but
Alderman Clement.
Is that something that we can make subject to inspection? I mean, I
Not if they're not doing any work. I mean, if they have to pull a building permit, then we have to inspect it.
It seems to me that because it no longer has to be a blood relative, and because if I remember what Director Marchand had been describing to us before, like you can have locked doors between the units, then it seems to me like we need to have something to make sure there's appropriate egress, there's smoke, I mean, it just seems like there should be some safety things we should be
That can all
inspecting
have
for.
happened beforehand. If I have a house that has, 3 egresses already, and I take one block of rooms, and all I'm actually doing when I convert to the ADU is changing the lock on the door, changing the knob on one of the doors to have a lock on it.
Alderman Clement.
when does the covenant have to be filed?
That's another good question. I think I would predicate it on, for the most part, we're looking at ADUs that will have a kitchen. There will be at least a plumbing and electrical permit pulled to install the kitchen facilities, and we will inspect those. So we could change the wording to say, after granting of a certificate of occupancy.
Yeah, Alderman Clements.
I would prefer that only because what I don't want to see happen is a situation where an investor comes in and buys the property, sits on it for, gets the permit, knows that the permit's good for a year, and then in month number 11 or 12, does whatever they have to do to move on to the next stage, carry that out for another year, do the next thing, carry that out for another year, all the while the clock's ticking down towards the 5 years. That now our fears are coming true. And so I like the idea of once the occupancy permit is there, or perhaps when the covenant is filed, because I would imagine that you wouldn't file that covenant until there's actually somebody living there. So one of the two things I think would be preferable to me.
Attorney Leonard, do you know when the covenant would be filed?
Would be required to be done shortly after the special exception, but I don't know.
And prior to occupancy?
Yeah,
Okay, well,
but that is a good question. I'm not sure.
Alderman Clements?
then I guess I would prefer the wording to say, once the certificate of occupancy is granted. My only other question is is there anything else in here that refers to a certificate of occupancy?
Alderman McCarthy?
Let's take care of them in sequence, because I think
Okay.
there's 2 other amendments I want to propose. So I would change my motion to say, add the following: for a period of at least 5 years following the granting of the certificate of occupancy for the accessory dwelling unit.
Okay. So you've heard the motion, amending number 5 to state for a period of at least 5 years following the granting of the certificate of occupancy for the accessory dwelling unit. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so that motion carries. Alderman McCarthy, you said you,
Yeah, I would move to amend paragraph 6 to add another paragraph at the end, which says receipt of the covenant and fees shall be, or granting of a certificate of occupancy of the accessory dwelling unit shall be contingent upon a receipt of the covenant and fees.
Okay, so granting of the certificate of occupancy shall be contingent upon the receipt of the covenant and fees?
Yeah. I'll get language to Sue after we,
Okay,
I have a question on that.
yes, Alderman Lopez.
With that new addition, does that mean that somebody could add on the accessory dwelling unit, have difficulty finding somebody to actually take it on, and then if they decide to sell the house, they lose everything they just put in because they never actually got it occupied?
Yes.
that's life in real estate.
I'm not
Well,
buying any
but-
to you.
But the granting of an occupancy permit doesn't necessarily mean someone's living there. It just says it's available, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
But
Which means the
we
work's
just
been
made the
done.
occupancy permit contingent on the covenant.
Yep.
Right.
But we do that for everything that we require, basically.
I'm just saying, you gotta get someone to sign your form.
No, the covenant is just an agreement with the owner. The owner simply has to say, I will abide by the laws of Nashua.
Okay, so the covenant isn't between the person who'd be living there in the
No.
accessory dwelling, it's just,
No, no,
Okay.
no, no, no.
okay.
It's
then
actually the
there's Nothing
city's,
that can go wrong here,
this,
it's
this,
bulletproof.
at least as I interpret it, the specific of that is, it makes it a lot easier for us to enforce because the owner can't come back and go, well, I didn't know that was. You
can
signed
also
a thing that
decide to
says you know
inspect
what you
before you do
did.
the covenant.
So, again, the motion by Alderman McCarthy is to amend paragraph 6 regarding the granting of the certificate of occupancy shall be contingent upon the receipt of the covenant and associated fees. Any other discussion? Oh, I thought you had. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And that motion carries.
And,
Okay, Alderman McCarthy.
yeah, I would move to amend paragraph 1 by reinstating the, structure language, and changing the 30% to 40 so that it reads, does not exceed 40% of the gross floor area of the primary structure, up to a maximum of 750. Well,
Okay, so we want to keep the state minimum as our maximum.
yeah,
Continue that, okay. So, again, the motion is to amend paragraph 1 to not to exceed 40% of the gross floor area of the primary structure up to a maximum of 750 square feet. So adding, changing the 30% to 40%. Alderman Clements?
So so I'm trying to visualize that. That takes out of the equation some homes that are smaller. Is that true, or does that make it more open?
no, it would basically make it difficult to do on, smaller on smaller single-story homes on small lots.
Oh, okay. If I could continue.
Oh, yeah, please.
So basically, so essentially, if you're not changing the actual footprint of your home,
Right,
then, and you have a smaller home, then it would be really hard to do this. But if
Yeah.
you had the room or could get the exception to add on or do whatever you needed to do, to increase the total square footage of your home, then you could still do that under this
right.
law. Okay. Okay.
Attorney Leonard, please.
I guess the way I'm understanding what you just said may be in contravention. It can never be, we can't require it be less than 750. So help me with the math. So if it's, because if we're saying 40% of the gross floor area with a maximum of 750, wouldn't that mean if you had a smaller house, Aren't we creating a,
not be able to do it in a very small house without adding on
right.
floor area,
So let
which
me see.
I mean, that was what I was asking you about before, is can we
Right.
do that?
Yeah,
But I think basically if we can have the subjective standard of, how does it say, it has to be a subordinate use.
Right.
We ought to be able to have an objective standard for that, which says it's, it's about a third of the space of the house.
okay, if we're only putting a maximum in, though, if it's, so as I understand your amendment, it would say 40% of the gross floor area of the primary structure, up to a
Yep.
maximum of 750 square feet?
Yeah,
Is that right? So it's 40%, okay. So we're not requiring it to be less than 750, all right, we're not saying that it is restricted to less than 750 square feet. It's just that if you have a small house, it's going to be by virtue of that.
yeah. And
I think that's a little different than what we discussed earlier.
okay.
Um,
So after we're done with amendments, I'm actually gonna make a motion to hold this until our next meeting so that, among other things, you guys can look at it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that one in particular, because this language is odd, I think, coming out of the state, and we've struggled with how to write some of this, so I certainly would welcome a little more time and more input even, and math calculations.
Alderman Clemmons?
Yeah, and, yeah, I mean, and I think I understand what you're trying to say, Attorney Leonard, because if the maximum is 750 square feet, but the state minimum is 750 square feet, then then the percentage area doesn't really matter. Is that, that's essentially, because if the state says it can't be smaller than 750, and we say it can't be bigger than 750, then the only thing it can be is 750 square feet. Is that correct?
Yes.
So the percentage area doesn't matter.
Well, that's the question I'm asking is, I mean, do you, by right, if you have a 650 square foot house,
Tiny house.
can you put a 750 square foot subordinate ADU on it? I think it's,
I
mean,
think, I
it's-
think the answer is no to that. So I
Oh,
agree
okay.
that that's, but that's what, and so he was right, he's trying to put an objective standard around the subjective, but just looking at how exactly do you word that?
Okay.
So that it's there, but yeah, I think that's certainly something worth looking at.
you get the intent of what we're trying to do.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and
Yeah.
it really is. Again, how the state worded, how they put it makes it a little difficult, but because we can also, the city can, again, control the aesthetic and other things, so it really is.
And like everything else, I mean, as Alderman Lopez pointed out, you can go to the zoning board and try to get an exception if it seems merited, for example, if you have an oddly shaped house or lot or something weird like that, like I can see, so there's flexibility in that, I guess, so.
Right, because
I guess I hate putting planning board in the position of having to make subjective judgments any more than I have to. I mean, we used to have, our sign ordinance used to refer to the number of festoons of lights that you were entitled to on outdoor advertising. It's like, so the planning board has to look at the plan and say, is that one festoon or two? If you get a better standard, so that it's clear just from the numbers, whether it meets the intent of the ordinance or not, I think we're better off. And yeah, I agree there, I suspect that this state law doesn't adequately address this exact point. to a point where municipalities can do the right thing and protect themselves at the same time, but I think we need to find something that is likely to work in that area.
Okay.
So we will stay
So the
with the
motion,
amendment, which is 40% of the
Yeah.
gross floor area,
yep,
and leave the maximum of 750 square feet. Correct?
right.
Okay. So that is the amendment. Any additional comments, questions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And that motion carries. So we've amended paragraphs 5, 6, and
And
1. Any, Alderman McCarthy?
Unless we have other amendments people want to propose, I would move that we hold 01736 as amended, refer it to the legal department for an opinion, and have the legal department forward it and their opinion to the planning board for another look.
Okay. So you've heard the motion to hold this ordinance referred to legal for an opinion and have legal then forward their opinion on to the planning board. And we will then reconvene and discuss it. Any comments, questions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, so the motion carries. General discussion? Alderman Clemmons?
I appreciate the conversation that we had this evening because this is, in my opinion, this is government at its best. When, you have a situation where you want to try to get to a compromise and you sit down, you talk about it, and you hash it out. That's government at its best. And I just want to thank my colleagues tonight and Attorney Leonard for being a part of that. So thank you.
Anyone else? Alderman Lopez?
I just wish government at its best was better at math, so we could have figured this out right away.
Um, Any other comments? Public comment? None? Remarks by the Alderman? Alderman Lopez?
Two huge events coming up this weekend, the Beer and Bacon Festival over in Milliard Park on Saturday, and then the Gate City Marathon on Sunday.
And I would also add, the Nashua Senior Center is having their plant sale on Saturday, and it sounds like the weather's finally going to make us think about gardening. And the Historical Society is also having their plant sale on Saturday. Anything else? There's no need for a non-public. Do I have a motion? Alderman Clemmons?
Motion to adjourn?
Heard the motion to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and we are adjourned at 8:15. Thank you.